Alright, so we're going to be looking at Chapter 6, Learning. Yay! Bet you guys are all excited. So without further ado, this is your instructor. We'll continue onwards. So here is each of you studiously learning, creating that effort in terms of, applying the knowledge and the wisdom that you're garnering from the textbook and also the articles and kind of coming along. So I'm hoping each of you are just like this individual. If not, that's okay. No hard feelings. But within that, we'll kind of delve into the area of learning and what it entails. So learning, what is it? So again, loggerhead sea turtles, hatchlings, are born knowing how to find the ocean and how to swim. As humans, we pride ourselves on our ability to learn. So that's one of the things we kind of look at is the implementation that as we see, we begin to implement. Once we hear, we begin to understand. Once we, some of us are visual learners, some of us are auditorial learners, and some of us are more tactile. We like to see things and also feel it and everything else, and that's how we kind of implement the knowledge. So, unlearned behaviors, instincts and reflexes. A lot of times when we look at it, instincts and reflexes are innate behaviors that an organism is born with. So in other words, it helps organisms adapt to their environment. So again, reflexes are motor neural reactions to a specific stimulus. In other words, simpler than instincts, involve activity of specific body parts, involve primitive centers of the central nervous system, and human babies are born with a sucking reflex. Within that, instincts, behaviors triggered by a broader range of events, aging, change of seasons. Again, it's more complex. Involve movement of the organism as a whole, in other words, sexual activity, migration, involve higher brain centers. So that's one of the things you kind of have to look at is the reflexes versus instincts. Understand reflexes is more reactionary. Instinct is triggered by various behaviors which allow for a broader implementation of events to take place. So what is learning? Learning also helps organisms adapt to their environment. Again, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior and knowledge that results from experience. Again, say for example, the things that you're learning, you're applying it. You're involving acquiring skills and knowledge through experience. And it also involves conscious and unconscious processes. But you also have associative learning, when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that occur together in the environment. There are many approaches to learning. Again, we'll look at the approaches that are part of behaviorism. You have classical, operant, and observational learning. So here's classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov research on the digestive system of dogs. And I'm pretty sure you're seeing that in your textbook. One of the things is it's a process by which we learn to associate stimuli and consequently to anticipate events. Pavlov noticed that dogs salivated not only at the taste of food, but also at the footsteps of the lab assistant's footsteps. He realized that organisms have two types of responses to its environment. You have unconditioned and conditioned. So the unconditioned is more unlearned, and conditioned is learned. In the most famous example, dogs were conditioned to associate the sound of a bell with food. So in other words, dogs were learning to associate the sound of a bell with food. When the dogs heard the bell, they anticipated food and began to salivate. So how does classical conditioning occur? So here it is, classical conditioning. Before conditioning, you have UCS and UCR, unconditioned stimulus, and unconditioned responses. So UCS involves a stimulus that elicits a reflexive response, in other words, food. And within that, the natural unlearned reaction to a stimulus, in other words, salivation and process in response to food takes place. So food, unconditional stimulus, creates salivation, in other words, unconditioned response. So during conditioning, neutral stimulus, NS, takes place by that of the stimulus that does not naturally elicit a response. Ringing a bell does not cause salivation by itself prior to conditioning. So say Example, if your dog had not learned that, you ring the bell, and if the dog had not initially implemented that into their learning process, they will not associate the ringing the bell with food. But if you do, you have the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Again, they're paired repeatedly. Within that, it creates salivation. And that's where you kind of see that take place, the jingling of your dog bowl, where the dog will automatically associate that with food. Therefore, they'll start salivating, wagging their tails, and everything else. After conditioning, conditioned stimulus, in other words, the stimulus that elicits a response after repeatedly being paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Then you also have the conditioned response, is primarily the behavior caused by the conditioned stimulus. So the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus, then creates the salivation, which becomes a conditioned response after the learning has taken place. So here you have a picture before conditioning, during conditioning, and then after conditioning, so you can kind of see the process taking place. Before conditioning, a dog salivates at the sight of food, the smell of food, and then before conditioning, you begin to, initially, again, this is all before, so you ring the bell, dog does not salivate, but then you start to associate food with the bell, then creates the salivation, and then you have the bell ringing, which then associates with the food, and therefore you create the salivation. So higher order conditioning, again, is an established conditioned response, is paired with a new neutral stimulus, the second order stimulus, so that eventually the new stimulus also elicits a conditioned response without the initial conditioned stimulus being presented. So again, here's the example. The cat is conditioned to salivate when it hears electric can opener. The squeaky cabinet door, the second order, is paired with the can opener. Therefore, the cat salivates when it hears the squeaky cabinet door. The cat learns to associate the cabinet door with the electric can opener, and therefore creates a chain reaction, which then leads up to the food itself. So acquisition. So these are the primarily general processes in classical conditioning. So you have acquisition, the initial period of learning when an organism learns to connect a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. Usually this requires there to be a very short time interval between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and for the pairing to repeated multiple times. Sometimes conditioning can occur when the interval is up to several hours, and the pairing occurs only once. And then you have extinction, decrease in the conditioned response when the unconditioned stimulus is no longer presented with the conditioned stimulus. If the food stops being presented with the sound of the bell, then eventually the dog will stop responding to the bell. Then you have spontaneous recovery, the return of a previously extinguished condition response following a rest period. So say, for example, you extinct the initial behavior, and then suddenly the return of a previously extinguished condition response comes about, therefore causing the same reaction to take place. Oh boy, excuse me. Sorry, I'm just yawning. Good golly. So the curve of acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. Again, the rising curve shows the conditioned response quickly getting stronger through repeated pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Then the curve decreases, which shows how the conditioned response weakens when only the conditioned stimulus is presented, therefore creating a conditioned or extinction. After a break or pause from conditioning, the conditioned response reappears, therefore creating the spontaneous recovery. So there you have a little small diagram there. So distinguishing between stimuli. Organisms need to be able to distinguish between different stimuli in order to respond appropriately. You have stimulus discrimination, stimulus generalization, and habituation. And we'll kind of go into that a little bit. So here you have stimulus discrimination. In other words, when an organism learns to respond differently to various stimuli that are similar. The example is a dog can discriminate between the specific bell sounds that signal food and a similar bell that sounds that does not signal food. And say, for example, if you have a squeaker, the dog will be able to differentiate that versus if you are using another sounded object. So they're able to discriminate between the noises and everything else and what is being implemented. Then you have stimulus generalization. In other words, when an organism demonstrates the conditioned response to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. In other words, if an individual learns to dislike a specific spider, they will usually then dislike all spiders. So initially, you just generalize everything. You kind of just clump it all into one big giant outlook of, and I think we do that with a lot of different elements that we kind of come across. Again, classical conditioning can also lead to habituation. In other words, learning not to respond to a stimulus that is presented repeatedly without change. As the stimulus is repeated, we learn not to focus our attention on it. In other words, we kind of just ignore it. So John B. Watson used the principles of classical conditioning in the study of human emotion. I believe that all behavior could be studied as a stimulus-response reaction. I believe the principles of classical conditioning could be used to condition human emotions. And here's connected a famous study with little Albert. Next slide will kind of go into the area of little Albert. So this is little Albert. So Watson exposed little Albert to certain stimuli and conditioned to fear them. Presented with neutral stimuli, in other words, a rabbit, a dog, cotton wool, a white rat, etc. Within that, Watson then paired these with a loud sound every time little Albert touched the stimulus. That caused him to feel fear. After repeated pairings, little Albert became fearful of the stimulus alone, such as the white rabbit, and anything that was fluffy. So again, that was one of the things that it created an initial fear. They were all furry, and therefore, through stimulus generalization, little Albert came to fear furry things, including Watson and a Santa Claus mask. So again, there's no evidence whether little Albert's fear was long-lasting or not. So here you have operant conditioning. Again, it's a theory proposed by B.F. Skinner. This is where organisms learn to associate behavior and its consequences. Therefore, you have reinforcement or punishment. But don't get the word punishment confused. I think that's where a lot of individuals kind of look at punishment from the element of a very adverse element, because we associate punishment with the negative. But again, what you're doing is you're decreasing the behavior. So pleasant consequences, desired results lead to behaviors more likely to occur again. Unpleasant consequences, undesired results, behavior is less likely to occur again. And others, when we show up to work, that's the behavior. We get paid, pleasant consequences. So we continue to show up to work every single day. And I know it kind of breaks down things to a very simplistic level, but and I've always said that before, human behavior is pretty simplistic. We're pretty simplistic individuals, organisms. So again, within that, Skinner conducted experiments, mainly with rats and pigeons, to determine how learning occurs through operant conditioning. So within that, you have the terminology. So positive, in other words, to add something; negative, to take away something; reinforcement, increase the behavior; punishment, decrease the behavior. So here's the Skinner box. So again, the study operant conditioning was applied, where Skinner placed animals, in other words, rats, inside an operant conditioning chamber. Within that, containing a lever that, when pressed, causes food to dispense as a reward. So again, it would kind of go through that element. So you have Skinner on the left, and you have a Skinner box on the right with the little tiny rat, and the lever being there. So positive reinforcements, we do this a lot when you're working in schools and school settings. Positive reinforcement meaning that something is added to increase the likelihood of behavior. In other words, example would be high grades, paycheck, praise. If you notice, if you say something like, oh, good job, good work, or you're doing a great work, it creates positive reinforcement. And negative reinforcement would be something is removed to increase the likelihood of behavior. In other words, a beeping sound that will only go away when you put your seatbelt on. It's an annoying behavior, or it's an annoying sound. Therefore, in order for you to make it stop, you initially will put your seatbelt on. And within that, you have to the right a sticker chart, a form of positive reinforcements and a tool for behavior modification. Once this little girl earns a certain number of stickers for demonstrating a desired behavior, she will be rewarded with a trip to the ice cream parlor. We do that a lot. You do that a lot with kids, where you're utilizing a lot of positive reinforcements to initially create various positive behaviors, or you go with negative reinforcements to initially remove the likelihood of a behavior. So positive punishment, something is added to increase or to decrease the likelihood of behavior. In other words, scolding a student for texting in class. You see this a lot happening in the classrooms. Negative punishment, something is removed to decrease the likelihood of behavior. In other words, taking away a favorite toy when a child misbehaves. And you can see that happening. I saw a lot when texting was a huge issue when I was at UNM years and years ago. But as time progressed, it became just an initial habituation to where everything just became normalized. Again, timeout is a popular form of negative punishment used by caregivers. When a child misbehaves, he, she, or they is removed from a desirable activity in an effort to decrease unwanted behavior. Example A, a child might be playing on the playground with friends and pushes another child. Example B, the child who misbehaved would then be removed from the activity for a short period of time. And that's where you're trying to modify the behaviors of the child. So shaping. Shaping is a tool used in operant conditioning. Instead of rewarding only the target behavior, we reward successive approximations of a target behavior. Behaviors are broken down into small achievable steps, useful when teaching a complex chain of events, commonly used by animal trainers. And I'll tell you this, if you look at your discussion questions and everything else, you'll see it broken down into that model. Initially, you'll see things broken up to where they're achievable. So week 1, it's more beneficial. You're seeing the outlook. Week 2, week 3, week 4, you're starting to see these different things kind of play out to try to shape a certain outlook. And a lot of it comes down to simply applying that within in-text citation and referencing and stuff like that. Again, you're reinforcing any responses that resembles the desired behavior. So again, there's the reinforcement. And as time progresses, you're hoping that the behavior becomes more concrete. Again, the reinforcement applies and that the response that most closely resembles the desired behavior is implemented. No longer reinforce previously reinforced responses. Therefore, I don't have to go back. And initially, you begin to learn it and apply it. Then begins to reinforce a response that even more closely resembles the desired behavior. Continue to do this until only the desired behavior is reinforced. So you get to the point where the behavior is already implemented and is seen overall. Therefore, it becomes a learned behavior. So primary and secondary reinforcers. Rewards to reinforce behavior can come in many forms: praise, stickers, money, toys, etc. Primary reinforcers, also those that are innate reinforcing qualities: food, water, sleep, sex, pleasure. And the value of these reinforcers does not need to be learned. Again, that's where the innate element kind of comes in. Pleasure is one of those things where we utilize that as and I think most of you guys are all college students. I'm hoping you're all college students. So again, that's where we utilize that. You have individuals who go through dates and everything else. Even during this pandemic, you have individuals still reinforcing that behavior. Again, because intimacy is one of the most desired elements within the human existence. Secondary reinforcers. Those that have no inherent value, their value is learned and becomes reinforcing when linked with a primary reinforcer. In other words, praise is linked with affection. So again, within that, money is only reinforcing when it can be used to buy other things, such as things that satisfy basic needs, or other secondary reinforcers. Tokens are a secondary reinforcer that can be exchanged for other things. Token economies are used in many settings to encourage correct behavior, such as prisons, schools, and mental institutions. So within that, partial reinforcement scales. Fixed versus variable, and you also have interval versus ratio. So with fixed, you're looking at the number of responses between reinforcements, or the initial amount of time between reinforcements is set and unchanging. Within that, the variable is the number of responses between reinforcements, or the amount of time between reinforcement, again, varies or changes. Within that, you have interval versus ratio. The interval schedule is based on the time between reinforcements, and the ratio, the schedule, is based on the number of responses between reinforcements. So again, fixed interval, reinforcement is delivered at predictable time intervals. Patients take pain relief medication at set times. So again, you have that element of an individual indicating, yes, at this given time, you better take it at these various intervals. Again, those are fixed. And the variable interval would be checking your Facebook status, your Instagram status. Initially, you have it's very unpredictable, in other words. And then you have fixed ratio. This would be a factory worker being paid for every X number of times an item is manufactured. Again, the reinforcement is delivered after a predictable number of responses. And then you have variable ratio. Reinforcement is delivered after an unpredictable number of responses. So therefore, like gambling, a lot of people try to utilize the lottery and everything else. So again, those are the variable ratios. So here you have partial reinforcement schedules. So you have the four variable ratio schedules. As we noted, the gambling aspect, unpredictable and yields high and steady response rates, with little, if any, pause after reinforcement. The fixed ratio, eyeglass salesman, in other words, predictable and produces a high response rate with a short pause after reinforcement. And then you have the variable interval schedule, unpredictable and produces a moderate, steady response rate. Restaurant managers. And then fixed interval, surgery patient, yields a scalloped shape response. Response pattern reflecting a significant pause after reinforcements. So you have the cumulative numbers of responses, in other words, the variable ratio, and then you have the fixed ratio. And then you have the variable intervals. Again, it's unpredictable and produces a moderate, steady response rate. And then you have the fixed intervals. So gambling in the brain. One of the things is, if you note here, some research suggests that pathological gamblers, in other words, individuals who incessantly gamble, use gambling to compensate for abnormally low levels of hormone norepinephrine, again, which is associated with stress and is secreted in moments of arousal and thrill. So again, you have those elements kind of being displayed. So cognition and latent learning. Edward C. Tolman found that learning could still occur without reinforcement. This introduced the idea that there is a cognitive aspect to learning. While studying rats, he found that if he put them in a maze to learn their way through it, they would eventually form a cognitive map of it. And cognitive map, a mental picture of the layout of an environment. After 10 sessions of the maze without food as a reinforcement, Food was placed at the exit, and the rats were able to very quickly exit the maze, showing that they had learned the way out. This is called latent learning. In other words, learning that occurs but is not observable in behavior until there is a reason to demonstrate it. And I think this is where we've seen that. We've seen that with individuals who play video games. There's not necessarily a need until there's initial reward, or there's some reason to demonstrate it. And I think that's one of the things we kind of come across is children may learn behaviors from their parents that they do not demonstrate until they are older. And I think this is one of the things we kind of see is even with dating relationships. And if you're in any of my other courses, I always use dating as one of the elements because I used to teach a lot on the elements of dating. And one of the biggest things is you may not notice it. Individuals at a young age may not showcase elements of dating until a later period of time. Again, what they do is they implement a lot of the elements they've learned, therefore they'll demonstrate it when they get older. And that's where we kind of come to that concern of learned behavior regarding abuse and stuff like that. Again, a child may learn the route to school from watching his parents drive there, but will not demonstrate this until they can drive themselves or have to get there by bike or walking. So cognitive maps. So here you have a cognitive map. Again, I found that rats use cognitive maps to navigate through a maze. And one of the questions is, have you ever worked your way through various levels on a video game? You kind of just work your way through it. You learn when to turn left or right, move up, down. In that case, you're relying on a cognitive map, just like the rats in a maze. That's where one of the biggest things that we kind of come across is, say, for example, when we implement that with, I don't know if anybody's ever done fire safety. You kind of run through initial outlook as you're going along. And so when there's an initial need, then you'll utilize that cognitive map. You'll kind of feel your way around. I can't even talk tonight. So that's one of the things you're kind of coming across is you begin to implement these different elements of cognitive mapping so that you're able to initially get to a level of a reward. So observational learning, in other words, modeling. So again, you have observational learning, in other words, learning by watching others and then imitating. The individual performing the imitated behavior is listed there. The spider monkey learned to drink water from a plastic bottle by seeing the behavior modeled by a human. And a lot of times we implement that. Children will model behaviors that are elicited by parents. And we do that on a daily basis. And I've always seen this. I saw this on the reservation. I saw this everywhere I went. One of the biggest things that I kind of came across was modeling behaviors of pickup trucks. For one, there is a need for it. But in addition to that, people begin to model behaviors based upon everyone else around them. And so within that, you begin to implement that in your everyday lives. You see that within society. You see that here and there. Again, that's one of the things you kind of see across the board. So observational learning. Yoga students learn by observing their yoga instructor, demonstrating the correct stance and the movements by her students. In other words, the live model. Models don't have to be present for learning to occur. Through symbolic modeling, this child can learn a behavior by watching someone demonstrate it on television. Again, that's one of the things you kind of come across is modeling can also be implemented on various networks. And that's where we kind of come across that is it more beneficial to teach kids through what is being observed through online? And I think we're seeing that right now across the board. And we're trying to see what works in terms of modeling behavior. And this can be seen with just the telehealth and telemental health and just the utilization of Zoom. And we're seeing that also across the board with teachers having to utilize Zoom to teach their kids or their students. And so you kind of see those different elements kind of taking place. Social learning theory. In order to explain how learning occurred within Without external reinforcement, Albert Bandura proposed social learning theory. He believed that observational learning involved more than just imitation, and that internal mental states must be involved, steps in the modeling process. Based upon social learning was the utilization of attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. So again, attention is focusing on the behavior. Retention, in other words, remembering what you observe. Reproduction, being able to perform the behavior. And motivation, must want to copy the behavior. Motivation depends on what happens to the model. So again, the vicarious reinforcement is the process where the observer sees the model rewarded, making the observer more likely to imitate the model's behavior. And vicarious punishment being the process where the observer sees the model punished, making the observer less likely to imitate the model's behavior. So here you have the Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. In a famous study known as the Bobo doll experiment, Bandura studied modeling of aggressive and violent behavior. So again, children observe adults acting aggressively towards a 5-foot Bobo doll. And the adult was then either punished, praised, or ignored for their behavior. The children were then given the opportunity to play with the Bobo doll. If the child had seen the adult punished, they were less likely to act aggressively toward the doll. If the child had seen the adult praised or ignored, they were more likely to imitate the adult. And then Bandura concluded that children watch and learn from the adults around them, which can have both pro-social and anti-social consequences. So there you have the little tiny image of the aggressiveness and stuff like that, which kind of takes place. So the question is, can video games make us violent? And researchers have indicated that yes, there is a correlation between watching violence and aggression in children. And you kind of see that take place from the social learning perspective. You have the attention being taken place. Child is focused on the video game. A lot of times as parents, what do we do is we end up, just due to time, just due to limitations, just due to everything, we're not able to devote a lot of attention to our children. Therefore, we utilize different social media proximities, social media elements. For example, we put a tablet in front of them, or we let them play video games longer just so that we're able to recuperate from our day and stuff like that. So then they have a level of retention, so they're remembering that. They're remembering that in their everyday actions, but they're also remembering that even in what they're doing in their actions, playing the video game. And they reproduce it. They reproduce it on a daily basis. The more and more they reproduce it, then it becomes a motivation. It becomes a hardwired motivation for them on a daily basis of, initially I want this, I want this, I want this. And that's where you start to see the violence kind of take place. In that when they're at school, they begin to implement a lot of these different actions because, again, like we talked about, the antisocial and pro-social behaviors. Within that, it became learned behavior. Therefore, when they're at school and things are not going their way, well, one, my attention is now going to be on this situation. Now I'm going to retain what I initially learned from the video game or what I initially learned on what I saw on TV. Therefore, I'm going to reproduce it. I'm going to do the same action, if that means hitting somebody, kicking somebody, biting somebody. My motivation is because, one, initially I don't want to get in trouble, or two, if I do get in trouble, nobody really punishes me anyway, because at home this is praised, this is okay, this is seen as a normal behavior. And so you kind of see these different things kind of play out. So again, you see this with violent video games. You see this across the board with different elements. Say, for example, music. You see it across with videos and stuff like that. So on to chapter 7. So again, this was a pretty quick chapter. I believe it was a pretty quick chapter. So if you have any questions, please send me an email. Other than that, that kind of concludes it for chapter 6. Have an awesome day, evening, morning, whichever time that you're actually watching this. For me, it is nighttime. That's the reason why I keep yawning. So again, if you have any questions, like I said, just shoot me an email. Have an awesome evening, daytime, whatever time period it is. Be safe, be awesome, and change the world.